Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 27th of June 2024. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the video at the moment. Pause the video. Right, okay. We'll go to, well actually we would normally go to Kharkiv and these two northern salients that the Russians have gained inside the Kharkiv border, but there's not a lot to look at there. We'll go to Emil Castelhelmi. In other words, there's no movement on the mapping today, but there will be a lot of activity in those areas. Emil Castelhelmi says, and this was yesterday's analysis, it gives us a little thread on this. Russia's operation in the northern side of Kharkiv has lasted over 6 weeks. There have been serious difficulties at both operational and strategic level. While the offensive is stuck, satellite images show the Russians have been fortifying the newly occupied areas. This is a bit of a worry. We have seen this previously, that we'd heard this, that they've been fortifying behind the lines that they'd taken. We know this because there have been a number of excavators that have been hit in that area. And that will make it harder for the Ukrainians to push the Russians right back to the border. The Kharkiv operation had 3 probable goals. 1, create confusion and tie Ukrainian reserves to a secondary direction so that progress could be made elsewhere. So that's drawing Ukrainian troops away from the, say for example, Donetsk front line. 2, form a buffer zone between Belgorod and Ukraine. 3, possibly get parts of Kharkiv within artillery range. So we've talked about that plenty of times before. I think those are all probably bona fide objectives that the Russians had in mind, and of course they've failed in all of them. We will go to this area. Let's just remind ourselves. So you've got this Lipsy area that the Russians were looking to take. Not only would that give them that buffer zone to stop Belgorod being hit so much the further south they get, but also it gets them within range of artillery range of the outskirts of Kharkiv. So that's about a 20-kilometer range there, or distance from Kharkiv, and they could start pummeling the outskirts of Kharkiv with their barrel artillery, and indeed tube artillery, so multiple launch rocket systems. At the moment, they have to hit it with guided glide bombs from planes and from S-300s from air defense systems that are parked back in Belgorod. So that was important, and of course they wanted to draw Ukrainian troops away from the front line, and it's been a massive failure in all 3 of those. In fact, a kind of 180 degree failure in certainly pulling Ukrainian troops away from the Donetsk front line, because Russian troops have been pulled away, and indeed I'm sure he'll go on to talk about this. So Russia was able to tie some Ukrainian forces to Kharkiv, but it wasn't able to exploit the initial momentum elsewhere on the front. In this situation, Russia has to divide its forces and spend power on a less important area while progress is slow everywhere. Now, sorry to repeat myself, but 50% of you are newbies anyway, and it's worth reminding ourselves of what's been going on. So they were, of course, aiming to, as mentioned, pull those forces from elsewhere on the front line, pull the Ukrainian forces from elsewhere, and to do that they had to apply 50,000 of their own troops to this sector. Now, those 50,000 troops, as I said many times before, could have been piled into, say, Chaziv Yar in the Bakhmut area, and that would have secured them Chaziv Yar. At the moment, they're struggling to take Chaziv Yar. They would have probably somewhat easily taken Chaziv Yar with those 50,000. So while this is a kind of sensible objective to draw troops away when looking at it in one way, in another way, actually, because you are using people to draw those people away rather than using those people to overwhelm those people you're trying to draw away. It's almost like 2 sides of a square. And if the fighting doesn't go particularly well for you, and you end up having to draw your own troops away, which is the case apparently, draw your own troops away from that eastern front line, then you've not only failed in drawing the Russian troops or Ukrainian troops away, but you've doubly failed in using more of yours. So there's that. Ukraine stabilized the front and relatively quickly, and have begun limited counterattacks. So recently, Ukrainians have taken back areas in Volchansk, Darytia, and Geopolitics, while Russians have made no additional gains. They've made no additional gains effectively in, goodness me, is it like a month now? The city of Kharkiv is still far away from Russian artillery, so empirically failed there. The so-called buffer zone is small, and increasing it would require additional forces. Russia has begun preparations to hold on to their gains. New satellite images reveal they're constructing fortifications north of Vovchansk, near the border with the Ukrainian side. So that is just around here. So we've got Vovchansk there, and in that sort of rural area behind Vovchansk, in those fields, that's where they are building at least some of their fortifications. The new fortifications are 150 to 400 meter long trenches built north and west of Vovchansk. As the Sentinel images are very low resolution, I double checked some of these from high resolution imagery, which I unfortunately can't publish. So unfortunately, Andrew Perpetua often has this, that if you get high resolution imagery, you're not allowed to publish it, on public domains. You have to just use it yourself for your own research or whatever as part of the licensing. But there you go. There are fortifications that have been built in those areas, although they are difficult to work out in any detail. The newly fortified zone is 2.5 kilometers deep at most and around 6 kilometers wide, not very effective against Ukrainian operations towards Belgorod. However, the work has started only recently, and it's possible there will be more new fortifications in the coming weeks. The Russians clearly do not want to lose what little they have achieved, which isn't much to begin with. They have transferred a lot of excavators to this area. The Ukrainians have also damaged and destroyed over 15 of them. Rather heavy losses for engineering equipment. And we've seen that on Andrew Perpetua's loss lists over the last few weeks, not for the last few days particularly, but there were a number of days in a row where the Russians were losing a lot of engineering vehicles. Russia is determined to fortify now, despite the losses. The project seems politically motivated, as there already is a proper defensive line on the Russian side of the border. It hasn't even been tested yet, as usually border raids don't go beyond the first villages. So here's an important point, that if you failed in this area, then just pull out, cut your losses, rather than have this sunk cost fallacy approach, which is, well, this is political, we've got to be seen to win something, so let's double down, and you end up putting more and more resources into something that is less and less viable. So rather than just use your own defenses back on the other side of the border, literally 5 kilometers that way. It's not that the Ukrainians are going to be invading here particularly. They might do the odd raid with the Russian defense or Russian volunteer corps or something like that, but it's unlikely, but they could do that. But they're not going to go for a major invasion. And so just go and sit in your own trenches you already made. But instead, they're at high cost to their own excavators, troops and contractors and whatever. They are losing men and materiel in this area. And you've got to remember, of course, that this was under the leadership of General Lapin, who has previously shown himself not to be very able at all. So he's going to want to prove something to his officers, the command above him. So he will be doubling down on trying to come out with some kind of success rather than cutting your losses. If you're going to the casino to bet on whatever, and you're down and you're losing, you cut your losses, say, right, I'm not just going to apply more and more money into this to try and win it back, because it looks like, statistically I'm going to lose all that money as well. So, I stop there. I've had a good time. Let's leave now. And because I'm not answerable to anyone but myself. So, I'm going to leave and whatever. But if I was thinking, oh, my missus has sent me to the casino and she really wants me to come back with loads of money. If I don't come back with loads of money, I'm going to get bollocking. Then I'm going to keep piling in loads of money here. And that's kind of Lapin's thought process, is that I have to double down, because if I go back with empty hands, I'm going to get the rollicking of my life, or, I'll be trying to fly out the window. Yeah. Anyway, Russia is determined to fortify now, despite the losses, as mentioned. The project seems politically motivated, as I just discussed, and there is already a proper defensive line on the Russian side of the border. It hasn't even been tested yet, as usually border raids don't go beyond the first villages. In the west, the Kharkiv situation caused a shift in the narrative. The urgency of supporting Ukraine became a pressing issue, and Ukraine was given the permission to strike Russia with long-range Western weaponry. One could ask, were the gains on the ground really worth it for Russia? And this is a really, really important point. Possibly the biggest failure of this whole attack is what it then caused with regard to people sending more aid to Ukraine in an expedited fashion. But even more important than that, changing restrictions about striking into Russia. And so this attack actually caused the destruction of the S-300 and S-400 systems around Belgorod, which then means that they can't hit Kharkiv with those systems anymore. It's absolutely catastrophic, really, for the Russians in terms of what this has achieved, or indeed what it hasn't achieved. The future for similar operations seems difficult. Russians might try to launch new attacks in the other directions, but Ukrainians have now more opportunities to respond to such attempts. Achieving the same results in a possible next offensive is now more challenging. There are some variables. Ukrainian losses are unknown, so we don't know what the price is they're paying for taking back these small border villages. And that's a really good point. I think, as I mentioned over the last few days, with the Ukrainians counterattacking, it will be more attritional for the Ukrainians, I would have thought, especially in the Vovchansk direction. Throwing the Russians out of the villages doesn't alter the general situation much. So the Ukrainian attempt to push the Russians out of Vovchansk is going to be costing the Ukrainians. There's no doubt about that. Right, anyway, thanks for that, Emil Castelhelmi. It's worth also mentioning, Dead District says the 83rd Airborne Assault Brigade, so this is another brigade that's had to pull out from this sector, from the Vovchansk sector. We heard about another one the other day. This is the 83rd Air Assault Brigade of the Russian army, totally defeated in Vovchansk. The Russian commanders withdrawing the brigade for replenishment. The brigade is incapable of fighting. Also, there are a lot of 500 in the brigade. I don't quite know what 500 is. That so 200 is dead, 300 is injured, isn't it? Cargo 200, cargo 300. I wonder whether 500 are deserters. Whether that is or 500 could be 300 plus 200. Deserters, it is deserters, yep. 200 dead, 300 casualty, 500 deserters. So interesting, and that's what we have heard from many sources. Right, we are now going to go down to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatove to Kreminna. And good news for the Ukrainians, some big gains in territory in the Terney and Torska area, I always do that, to the west of Kreminna, north of the Serebyansky forest, on the way to Yampolivka. And where else do we have? Oh, there's another Bilorivka. I didn't notice there was a third one there. Terney and Torska, of course. Now, there are some claiming that actually this happened last month. And we're just finding evidence for it now. That's something I have seen, but who knows. Terney to Yampolivka, fighters from the 95th Assault Brigade, Azov 60th and the 93rd and 63rd conducted counteroffensive operations in the area of populated areas. Released almost 3 square kilometers, so they've liberated 3 square kilometers. But that might not have happened over the last few days, for example. Surat Map says over the last days, though, they managed to recapture numerous positions east of Terney, the Ukrainians. So these two seem to claim that it's happened over the last few days. Which is one other source I saw said happened last month. But nonetheless, that's really good news for the Ukrainians there. And if it is recent, if they are counterattacking presently, then that's the sort of thing where you'd hope they get some momentum and could carry on shifting the Russians. And then that would cause the Russians to maybe start to panic and think, oh, we're doing quite well here, so maybe we should draw some troops away from there to support ours up there. And then that allows the Ukrainians to have a breather down here or something like that. Certainly good news that a large area. So Surat Maps has this whole square liberated. Deep State Maps has several areas coming further to the south of that sector. So good news. Right, Ukrainians have been pushed back a little bit near this railway line on the way to Vyimka, as according to Deep State Map. Hardly any change there though, but just a little area that they now the Russians now control. And then when we get to Rozdalivka, north of Soledar, north of Bakhmut, so we have Bakhmut there, Chasiv Yar to its west, Soledar just north of there, and north of there on the way to Seversk we have Rozdalivka. And I showed you this yesterday, but I hadn't updated the map at that point. Now I've updated the map. We have here it is, the Rozdalivka area. The Russian army managed to capture most of the locality. I think there was a flag planted in there a few days back, so it's an indication that they were making gains. They were inside Rozdalivka, and now Surat Maps has them controlling all of that. Andrew Perpetua has actually, someone asked me not to have both the blue lines up because it was confusing. It's difficult. Both JR and myself were so used to this map, we don't get so confused, but I do get that. So taking the Russian defensive line itself off there. What have I just done? Lines, there we go. I need to get rid of that. There we go. So the two blue lines to note for Andrew Perpetua, the Russian defensive lines and the Ukrainian defensive lines, and then in between is the grey zone. Anyway, taking that out, you can see clearly that Russia have made these gains up into Rozdalivka and pretty much control most of that, as according to Suriyat maps. The other map has not changed their mapping yet, but it could be just a difference in the timing of when they do their mapping. Bakhmut area in Chaziv Yar, we see no changes to the front line there. Again, that's exceptionally good news for the Ukrainians. It is tough fighting there. I know of people who have been lost from there. I don't know them personally, but through other people I know of some troops who have been lost there, international troops actually, in the Chaziv Yar area, and that'll probably filter out in the next couple of days. I won't say anything just in case. I shouldn't, but yeah, it is really tough fighting there, and as it is in so many places on the front line. No change anywhere coming down to the south, and even at Toretsk region, there's no change to the front lines near to Pivichne that we have seen over the last few days. That was that kind of quite opportunistic, I think, attack by the Russians. They took a load of ground. I don't know whether that's something they're going to really concentrate on, or whether that was just a bit of capitalizing on some rotations or something that were taking place. They have made a small gain further to the south, though, just north of a place called Novoselivka, another one, on the way to New York. So there we have a little bit of a gain, as according to Suriyat maps. Just wondering where that... Yeah, actually, they do talk about that here, which is the Russian army began to advance towards the city of New York. After several days of fighting, the troops managed to take the first trenches and houses in the town. A new axis has been opened towards the Toretsk agglomeration. That's a worry if they are trying that out as well. They could just be prodding and probing everywhere. Ukrainians always need to be on their toes. Interesting that there are no changes at all to any of the mapping along the Avdiivka salient. So good news for the Ukrainians, although when we come further to the south into Krasnohorivka, this sort of town between Mariinka and Avdiivka, south of Novelska, we have the Russians making some gains, as according to Deep State map, that weird area where there had been a Ukrainian attack. No one's quite sure exactly when it happened, but footage came out, the Ukrainians down here. Everyone changed their mapping. It seems that it makes sense to me. I can't imagine the Ukrainians would be trying to control areas right down here. But Deep State map showing that the Russians have taken back control of that area. A tiny couple of houses and whatnot there, now under Russian control. And the Russians have also taken more control over the roads and suburban neighborhoods to the west of Krasnohorivka, as according to Suriyat maps there. Kind of rectangle of land, and then a small amount just further to the southeast, as according to Deep State map. So quite a bit of movement perhaps in Krasnohorivka, fairly hot area of the front line. And that's it for the front line. There's no change again to Robotyne, to Velikonovosilka, and I think that's really good news. Robotyne was a place where the Russians were just taking consistent, although somewhat sporadic, consistently sporadic, is that a thing? You know, it wasn't every day, but it was like a few times a week. They would take some chunks here, some chunks around Verbove. They haven't done that for a good week or so now, and that's, again, good news for the Ukrainians. Have the Russians sort of run out the ability to commit themselves even to these smaller localized attacks? Are the Ukrainian drones able to be effective in keeping the Russians back from attacking? We know that the Ukrainians are just using drones so much at the moment. If you're making 90,000 FPV drones a month, you can imagine how many drones are used by any given unit on a daily basis, just throwing those drones against the Russians and keeping them hemmed in. But I don't know. That's a complete supposition there. Anyway, that is the Frontline update for today. Really appreciate your support. Thank you so much for your continued support of the channel. Please click on the subscribe and like buttons if you haven't already, and all that kind of stuff. I may have some issues getting out my content tomorrow, as I'm running off up to a school reunion of all things, a random thing that's popped up in the capital. So that's going to be exciting. But yeah, I'll try and get everything done early in the morning. See how it goes. Anyway, take care, everybody. Speak soon. Toodle pips.